The wolf pack had been circling for 3 days, and Isaac Drummond knew they weren't leaving. Through the gun port of his cabin, he counted 8 of them, ribs showing through matted fur, eyes fixed on his door with the patient hunger of predators who understood their prey had nowhere to go. The temperature had dropped to -70 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill an exposed man in minutes, cold enough to make even wolves desperate. Isaac had enough firewood for maybe 5 more days, enough food for 10 if he rationed carefully, but the wolves could wait longer than that. What the starving pack didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that Isaac had spent the previous summer building something no other mountain man in the Montana Territory had ever attempted, and in 2 hours, when darkness fell completely, he would use it. Before we dive into Isaac's story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if survival stories like this fascinate you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode might just save your life someday. The wolves arrived on December 9th, 1838, 3 days after the blizzard that had buried Isaac Drummond's Montana cabin under 4 feet of snow. Isaac had been trapping beaver along the Madison River for 6 winters, and he'd seen wolves before, but never like this. These animals moved with the calculated precision of starvation, spreading out in a loose perimeter around his cabin, testing approaches, watching for weakness. Isaac was 53 years old, a Virginia carpenter who had come west after his wife died of fever in 1832. He'd learned trapping from French Canadians near Fort Union, saved his money, and established this isolated camp 2 years ago, specifically because it was far from competition and danger. The location offered everything a trapper needed: beaver ponds within walking distance, fresh water from the creek, timber for building and fuel, and enough distance from established trails that he rarely saw another human being. But isolation was now his enemy. The nearest trading post was 40 miles south, impossible to reach in this cold even without wolves. His closest neighbor, a trapper named William Chen, had a cabin 12 miles east, but Isaac hadn't seen him since October. For all practical purposes, Isaac was alone in a wilderness that was actively trying to kill him. The cabin itself was solid. Isaac had built it carefully during his first summer here, using techniques he'd learned as a carpenter. Good corner notching, proper chinking, a strong door with interior bar, and one small window he could shutter from inside. It had kept him safe through 2 hard winters already. But it had one critical flaw that Isaac hadn't fully appreciated until now. Only one exit. The wolves had figured this out faster than he had. They maintained their loose circle, never all sleeping at once, always leaving at least 2 animals watching the door. Isaac tested them on the second day, opening the door and firing his rifle into the air. The wolves scattered but didn't flee. Within an hour, they were back, closer than before, understanding that the noise meant nothing without actual threat. Isaac closed the door and sat by his fire, thinking. He had food and water. He had firewood, though not unlimited. He had ammunition, though shooting wolves one by one would eventually empty his powder horn without eliminating the pack. Most mountain men in this situation would simply wait, hoping the wolves would lose interest or that weather would change. But Isaac Drummond wasn't planning to wait. He was planning to leave. Isaac's escape plan relied on something the wolves couldn't see and didn't know existed. 60 feet behind his main cabin, hidden in a dense cluster of pine trees, stood a second structure. From the outside, it looked like a standard smokehouse, small, windowless, with a stone chimney and heavy door. Isaac had built it during his first summer at this location, telling himself it was for meat preservation and storage. That was partially true. But the real reason for the second building was something Isaac had never shared with another living soul. The idea had come to him during his second winter in the mountains, 1836-37, when a late spring blizzard had trapped him in his cabin for 8 consecutive days. He'd had plenty of supplies and had been perfectly safe, but the psychological weight of confinement had affected him more than he'd expected. He'd found himself staring at the door, imagining scenarios where he might need to leave but couldn't. Fire, structural damage, or simply the need to access supplies stored elsewhere during extended bad weather. Mountain men typically built everything in one structure for efficiency and warmth. But Isaac's carpenter training had taught him about redundancy and options. Buildings failed. Circumstances changed. Having a single point of failure, even a well-built one, violated every principle of good planning he'd learned. So, during the summer of 1837, he'd built the smokehouse. It took 3 weeks, working alone, cutting and fitting logs, building the stone chimney, installing the door. He'd positioned it carefully, far enough from the main cabin that a single disaster wouldn't destroy both structures, close enough that moving between them wouldn't be impossible during winter. But distance created a problem. In good weather, 60 feet meant nothing. In winter, especially during wolf siege or extreme cold, 60 feet of open ground might as well be 60 miles. Isaac couldn't safely move between the buildings if threats were present. The wolves would catch him halfway. The cold would kill him before he made it across. The solution had come to him while digging the foundation for the smokehouse. He was already excavating. He had access to timber. He had time and privacy. And he had enough carpentry knowledge to understand that what he was considering, while ambitious, wasn't actually impossible. Isaac had decided to connect the 2 buildings underground, not with a crawl space or a simple trench, but with a proper tunnel, reinforced, protected, and completely hidden from anyone who didn't know it existed. The project had consumed his entire summer. He'd worked carefully, slowly, never rushing, making sure every support beam was solid, every joint was tight, every detail was right. By September, when early snow started falling, the tunnel was complete. He'd used it occasionally during the following winter, mostly to test its reliability and to move supplies without making tracks in the snow. It had worked perfectly, but until now, it had never been truly necessary. Until now, it had been interesting preparation rather than desperate salvation. Isaac stood and walked to the corner of his cabin where the tunnel entrance waited beneath a disguised floor panel. The tunnel entrance was hidden beneath what appeared to be a solid section of cabin floor in the northwest corner, away from the fire and the door. Isaac had constructed a removable panel, 18 inches square, fitted so precisely into the surrounding floorboards that the seams were nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. He'd carved the panel from a single piece of seasoned pine, then deliberately aged it with dirt and ash to match the wear patterns of the surrounding floor. Even if someone searched his cabin thoroughly, they likely wouldn't notice it. Isaac knelt beside the panel and worked his fingers into a small groove he'd carved along one edge. The panel lifted smoothly, revealing a square shaft descending straight down into darkness. A wooden ladder was fixed to one wall of the shaft, rungs spaced 12 inches apart, leading down 6 feet to the tunnel floor. Cold air rose from the opening, not as cold as outside, but noticeably cooler than the cabin's heated interior. He'd engineered the entrance shaft with deliberate care. 6 feet depth served multiple purposes. It placed the tunnel below the frost line, preventing the worst of the freeze-thaw cycles that could destabilize the structure. It provided enough earth above the tunnel ceiling to support the weight of snow accumulation without collapse. And it made the tunnel difficult to detect from outside, even if someone was specifically searching for underground construction. The shaft walls were lined with fitted planks to prevent cave-ins and to provide a smooth, clean surface. Isaac had learned from his carpentry days that rough excavation invited problems. Loose dirt meant instability. Instability meant collapse. He'd invested the extra time to do it properly, and 2 winters later, the shaft walls remained solid and true. Isaac lit his oil lantern, adjusted the wick to a steady flame, and began his descent. The ladder held firm under his weight, just as it had during dozens of previous trips. At the bottom, he stepped onto the tunnel floor and stood upright. The tunnel was 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, requiring him to move in a crouch, but providing enough space to carry supplies or move quickly if necessary. The tunnel ran straight for the first 20 feet, then curved gently to the right for another 40 feet before reaching the smokehouse. Isaac had deliberately designed this curve rather than building a straight line. A curved tunnel was harder to collapse completely if one section failed. It also made the tunnel impossible to see through from end to end, which meant if someone discovered one entrance, they couldn't immediately see what lay at the other end. Every 3 feet along the tunnel's length, timber support frames reinforced the structure. Each frame consisted of 2 vertical posts supporting a horizontal beam, creating a rectangular opening. The frames were notched together and wedged tightly between floor and ceiling, distributing weight across the entire system. Between the frames, smaller diameter poles ran perpendicular to the tunnel's length, covered with bark and packed earth, creating a solid ceiling that had held without sagging through 2 full winter cycles. Isaac moved forward into the darkness, his lantern casting shadows on the tunnel walls. Isaac hadn't always planned to build a tunnel. The idea emerged from observation and necessity, born during a chance encounter in the spring of 1837. He'd traveled to Fort Union for supplies that April, and while waiting for the trading post to process his pelts, he'd witnessed something that would fundamentally change his approach to survival in the mountains. A group of Crow traders had arrived at the fort with stories about a band of trappers who'd been caught by a late blizzard in the Absaroka Range. The trappers had taken shelter in a well-built cabin, confident they could wait out the storm. But the blizzard had lasted 11 days, far longer than anyone expected, and an avalanche had partially buried the cabin, blocking the door completely. The trappers had enough food and firewood, but they were entombed. By the time the snow melted enough for them to dig out, 2 of the 4 men had died from the carbon monoxide that built up from their fire without proper ventilation. The story had circulated through the fort as a cautionary tale about choosing cabin locations carefully away from avalanche zones. But Isaac had heard something different. He'd heard a story about men who died because they had no alternative exit. The cabin itself had been sound. The men had been prepared. But they'd built a single-point system with no redundancy, and when circumstances blocked that single point, preparation became irrelevant. Isaac had spent the 3-day journey back to his own cabin thinking about exits and options. His location wasn't threatened by avalanches, but plenty of other circumstances could block a door. Fire damage, structural collapse from heavy snow load, even sustained attack by animals or hostile humans. If his only exit became impassable, he'd be trapped just as surely as those men in the Absaroka Range. The conventional solution would be to add a second door or a window large enough to climb through. But additional openings meant additional weak points in the structure. Each door or window was a place where heat escaped, where weather penetrated, where security was compromised. Isaac's carpenter instincts rejected the idea of weakening his cabin's integrity just to add emergency exits. The tunnel concept had emerged during a restless night in late April. Underground passage would provide an exit that couldn't be blocked by snow, couldn't be observed by threats outside, and wouldn't compromise the cabin's structural integrity. It would require significant work, but Isaac had time, he had tools, and he had the skills to attempt something most mountain men wouldn't consider possible. The more he thought about it, the more sense it made. He was already planning to build a smokehouse for food storage. If he positioned it correctly and built both structures with tunnel access in mind, he could create a system that gave him genuine security without visible vulnerability. The wolves circling outside couldn't block what they didn't know existed. The cold couldn't penetrate what was underground and protected. Isaac had started digging in May of 1837. By September, his tunnel was complete. Now, 16 months later, it was about to save his life. The actual excavation had been far more difficult than Isaac initially expected. He'd begun in early May, as soon as the ground thawed enough to work, starting from inside his main cabin where he'd planned the tunnel entrance. The first challenge was removing dirt without creating obvious piles outside that would advertise his project to anyone passing through the area. Isaac solved this by using the excavated soil to build up the ground around both cabin foundations, creating gradual earthen ramps that improved drainage and looked intentional rather than suspicious. He carried the dirt out in leather sacks during evening hours, spreading it thin across wide areas, mixing it with existing soil until the additions became invisible. The process was tedious and time-consuming, but it eliminated evidence of underground construction. Digging the vertical shaft was straightforward. Isaac excavated straight down 6 feet, removing dirt 1 bucket at a time, climbing up and down a rope ladder he'd rigged for the purpose. Once he reached proper depth, he lined the shaft walls with fitted planks, creating a square wooden column that prevented cave-ins and provided a clean working space. The horizontal tunnel presented different problems. Isaac couldn't simply dig forward into darkness and hope the direction stayed true. Without proper alignment, the tunnel might miss the smokehouse entirely or surface at the wrong location. He solved this by using a compass and careful measurements. Before starting the horizontal excavation, he'd placed iron stakes at both intended tunnel endpoints underground depth. By taking regular compass bearings and measurements, he kept the tunnel aligned within inches of his intended path. The digging itself was exhausting work. Crouched in confined space, Isaac excavated forward 1 foot at a time, removing dirt behind him in leather sacks that he dragged backward through the completed sections. His progress averaged 3 to 4 feet per day during the first weeks, slower than he'd hoped, but sustainable. The clay-rich Montana soil was dense and heavy but stable, holding its shape without immediate collapse. Every 3 feet of forward progress, Isaac stopped digging and installed support frames. He'd pre-cut the timber during winter months, selecting straight pine logs 4 to 5 inches in diameter, cutting them to precise lengths for vertical posts and horizontal beams. Each frame required careful fitting and placement. The vertical posts needed to sit firmly on the tunnel floor and wedge tightly against the ceiling. The horizontal beam had to span the tunnel width without sagging, bearing the weight of earth above. Isaac notched each joint where posts met beams, creating interlocking connections that distributed stress across multiple contact points rather than relying on friction alone. He'd learned this technique building barn frames in Virginia, and it translated perfectly to underground construction. Once a frame was positioned and wedged tight, Isaac tested it by hanging his full body weight from the horizontal beam. If it held without movement, he continued forward. If it showed any flex or settling, he adjusted until it was absolutely solid. Between support frames, he laid smaller poles perpendicular to the tunnel direction, creating a lattice ceiling. The lattice ceiling was only the first layer of Isaac's waterproofing system. Over the perpendicular poles, he'd laid sheets of bark he'd stripped from fallen trees during previous seasons. Bark provided a flexible, water-resistant membrane that prevented soil from sifting through the gaps between poles, while allowing the structure to settle and adjust without cracking. Isaac had learned from building roofs that rigid waterproofing failed when structures moved, but flexible materials adapted and survived. Above the bark layer, he'd backfilled with the original excavated soil, packing it carefully to eliminate air pockets. Air pockets meant eventual settling, and settling meant surface depressions that could reveal the tunnel's location or, worse, cause structural failure. Isaac tamped each 6-inch layer of backfill thoroughly before adding the next, creating density that matched the surrounding undisturbed earth. But soil and bark alone couldn't prevent water infiltration during spring thaw or heavy rain. Montana's freeze-thaw cycles meant groundwater movement, and any tunnel that ignored drainage would eventually flood or collapse from saturation. Isaac addressed this by engineering a drainage system into the tunnel floor itself. Along the right side of the tunnel, he dug a shallow channel approximately 4 inches wide and 3 inches deep, running the entire length from cabin to smokehouse. This channel sloped gradually downward toward the smokehouse end, dropping roughly 6 inches over the tunnel's 60-foot length. The slope was subtle but sufficient to encourage water flow through gravity alone. Isaac lined the drainage channel with flat stones where he could find them near the creek, creating a crude but effective stone gutter. In sections where suitable stones weren't available, he used split logs laid lengthwise, carved with a shallow groove down their center. The drainage system worked by capturing any water seepage from walls or ceiling, channeling it along the tunnel length, and directing it toward a sump pit he'd excavated beneath the smokehouse. The sump pit was a cylindrical hole 3 feet deep and 2 feet in diameter, dug directly beneath the smokehouse floor. Any water that entered the tunnel system would eventually flow into this pit, where it would slowly percolate into the surrounding soil or evaporate during warmer months. The pit's location beneath the smokehouse was deliberate. If it ever filled completely during exceptional weather, the overflow would surface inside the smokehouse rather than flooding the tunnel itself, and Isaac could bail it out manually. This drainage engineering was perhaps the most critical element of the entire project. A flooded tunnel was worse than no tunnel at all. Water would undermine support frames, saturate timber until it rotted, and create ice blockages during winter that could split support beams and collapse entire sections. Isaac had seen enough failed construction in his carpentry years to understand that managing water was the difference between structures that lasted decades and structures that failed within seasons. By late July, the tunnel excavation was complete, all support frames were installed, and the drainage system was functional. Isaac tested it by pouring 20 buckets of water into the cabin entrance and watching it flow smoothly through the channel toward the smokehouse sump. The system worked perfectly. With the structural work complete, Isaac focused on making the tunnel practical for actual use. The bare earth floor was uneven and treacherous in darkness, with protruding roots and stones that could trip an unwary traveler. Isaac spent 2 weeks in August improving the walking surface, removing obstacles, filling low spots with gravel, and creating a path that could be navigated safely even without light. He installed iron hooks along the support beams at regular intervals, providing anchor points for rope that could serve as a guide rail in complete darkness. The rope wasn't necessary when carrying a lantern, but Isaac planned for contingencies. If his lantern failed, or if circumstances required moving through the tunnel without light, the guide rope would allow him to navigate by touch alone, maintaining direction and avoiding obstacles. Ventilation required attention. A sealed tunnel would accumulate stale air, carbon dioxide from respiration, and potentially dangerous gases from decomposing organic matter in the surrounding soil. Isaac addressed this by drilling small ventilation holes at both ends of the tunnel, angled upward through 6 feet of earth to reach the surface. Each hole was only 2 inches in diameter, too small to be obvious from above, but large enough to allow air circulation. He covered the surface openings with flat stones that permitted airflow while preventing rain, snow, and small animals from entering. The ventilation system created a gentle air current through the tunnel, drawing fresh air from one end and exhausting stale air from the other. The effect was subtle but measurable. Isaac tested it by lighting a candle at the cabin entrance and watching the flame lean consistently toward the smokehouse, indicating steady airflow. The tunnel would never be as comfortable as open air, but it wouldn't suffocate him either. Isaac's final modification was adding emergency supplies at the tunnel's midpoint. He excavated a small alcove into the wall, just large enough to hold a wooden box containing backup provisions, spare candles, matches wrapped in oilcloth, dried meat, a water flask, and a small knife. If he ever became trapped in the tunnel for any reason, these supplies might mean the difference between survival and death. The first real test came in November of 1837, shortly after the first heavy snowfall. Isaac deliberately waited for a day when snow was falling steadily, creating conditions that would obscure tracks and test the tunnel's winter functionality. He entered through the cabin, carrying a lantern and a sack of supplies, and navigated the full length to the smokehouse without incident. The tunnel was cold, but not unbearably so, perhaps 10 degrees warmer than the outside air. The support frames showed no stress or movement. The drainage channel was dry. The ventilation holes remained clear, despite snow accumulation above. Isaac emerged inside the smokehouse, set down his supplies, and returned through the tunnel to the cabin. Total travel time was less than 5 minutes each direction. The system worked. Isaac had created something that violated conventional mountain man wisdom, but served his specific needs perfectly. Now, 13 months later, with wolves circling above and escape impossible by conventional means, his unconventional solution was about to prove its worth. Isaac waited until full darkness had settled over the Montana wilderness before making his move. The wolves were most active during twilight hours, but deep night often brought a lull in their vigilance as the pack rotated, which animals remained alert. Through his gunport, Isaac watched the wolves settle into their positions. 2 remained visible near his door, their forms barely distinguishable in the darkness. The others had moved into the trees, presumably to shelter from the bitter cold while maintaining their perimeter. He'd spent the previous hour preparing carefully. His essential supplies were already packed. Beaver pelts representing 2 months of work, his spare rifle and ammunition, dried meat and pemmican sufficient for 2 weeks, an extra blanket, and the small leather pouch containing his money and personal papers. Everything fit into 2 canvas packs he could carry through the tunnel without excessive difficulty. Isaac banked the fire in his main cabin carefully, reducing it to coals that would smolder for hours without producing obvious smoke. He wanted the wolves to believe he was still inside, settled for the night, presenting no threat and taking no action. The longer they remained focused on the main cabin, the more time he'd have to put distance between himself and this location once he emerged from the smokehouse. He lifted the concealed floor panel and descended into the entrance shaft, pulling both packs down after him. The tunnel was profoundly dark, the kind of darkness that existed only underground where no trace of ambient light could penetrate. Isaac lit his lantern and adjusted the flame to a moderate level, bright enough to see clearly, but conservative with oil. He'd need the lantern for several hours yet. Moving through the tunnel with 2 heavy packs required awkward maneuvering in the confined space. Isaac couldn't stand upright, so he adopted a crouched walk, holding the lantern in his left hand while dragging 1 pack behind him with his right. The second pack he wore on his back, though it scraped against the tunnel ceiling with each step. Progress was slower than his previous unencumbered trips, but the tunnel's smooth floor and guide rope made navigation straightforward. The temperature in the tunnel was noticeably warmer than the outside air, though still well below freezing. Isaac's breath formed clouds in the lantern light, and frost had formed on some of the wooden support beams, creating crystalline patterns that sparkled as he passed. The drainage channel along the right side was partially filled with ice, but it hadn't expanded enough to cause structural problems. Isaac paused halfway through to catch his breath and listen. The earth above him was silent except for the faint creaking of frozen timber settling under snow weight. No sounds of pursuit, no indication the wolves had detected his movement. Underground, he was invisible and silent, moving beneath their awareness toward safety they couldn't prevent. He continued forward. The tunnel curved gently to the right, and Isaac followed the curve, his lantern casting shadows on bark-covered walls that had protected him as he'd planned. The smokehouse entrance shaft appeared ahead, marked by the ladder ascending toward the concealed floor panel above. Isaac climbed the ladder slowly, mindful of the packs weighing him down and the need for silence. At the top of the shaft, he extinguished his lantern and listened intently in complete darkness. The smokehouse had no windows, making it impossible to see outside, but sound traveled clearly through the log walls. He could hear wind moving through the pine trees surrounding the structure. Farther away, he heard a wolf howl, long and mournful, somewhere near his main cabin 60 feet distant. He waited 5 full minutes, listening for any indication that wolves had detected his presence in the smokehouse. The building's entrance faced east, away from the main cabin, positioned so that anyone approaching from the main structure would be visible from the creek beyond. Isaac had chosen this orientation specifically for situations like this, though when he'd built it, he'd been thinking more about human threats than animal ones. The smokehouse interior was cramped and cold, barely 8 feet square, with most of its space occupied by the racks Isaac used for meat preservation. He'd stored supplies here throughout the fall, knowing the tunnel made it accessible even during the worst weather. Stacked against the walls were additional food stores, spare traps, ammunition, and the leather cases containing his most valuable pelts from earlier in the season. Isaac had a decision to make. He could wait here until dawn, hoping the wolves would eventually lose interest in the main cabin and disperse, or he could use the darkness and his head start to put serious distance between himself and this location, traveling through the night toward William Chen's cabin 12 miles east. Both options carried risks. Waiting meant trusting that the wolves wouldn't discover the smokehouse or that some other circumstance wouldn't trap him here as effectively as they'd trapped him in the main cabin. Moving meant traveling through extreme cold and darkness with a wolf pack somewhere behind him, though presumably still focused on the cabin they believed he occupied. Isaac chose movement. Staying in one place had nearly killed him already. The tunnel had given him the gift of escape, and he intended to use it fully. He pulled on an additional layer of clothing from his supplies, wrapped a scarf around his face, leaving only his eyes exposed, and prepared for the brutal cold outside. He lifted the wooden crossbar from the smokehouse door and eased it open 6 inches, peering out into the darkness. The forest was a wall of black shapes against slightly less black sky. Snow covered everything in smooth, unbroken white that reflected what little starlight penetrated the cloud cover. Isaac saw no movement, heard nothing except wind and the distant creek. He slipped outside, pulling both packs after him, and closed the door quietly. The cold hit him like a physical blow, even through his layers. Minus 70 degrees felt like being stabbed with thousands of frozen needles. Isaac knew he had perhaps 3 hours of safe travel before the cold would overwhelm even his preparation. He turned east, away from his cabin and the wolves, and began walking into the Montana darkness. Isaac reached William Chen's cabin 4 hours before dawn, half frozen but alive. The Chinese trapper had seen his approach and had a fire roaring by the time Isaac stumbled through the door. They didn't speak much that first night. William understood immediately that something serious had driven Isaac to travel in such conditions, and he simply provided warmth, food, and a place to sleep without demanding explanations that could wait until morning. Over the following days, as Isaac recovered from his ordeal and the cold spell finally broke, he told William about the wolves, the siege, and his escape through the tunnel. William listened with the careful attention of a man who understood that survival in the mountains often depended on learning from others' experiences. He asked detailed questions about the tunnel's construction, the drainage system, the support frames, and the concealed entrances. Word of Isaac's tunnel spread through the trapping community that spring when men gathered at Fort Union for the trading season. The story grew with each telling, as frontier stories often did. But the core facts remained consistent. A mountain man had built an underground passage between two structures, and that passage had allowed him to escape a situation that would have killed most men. Other trappers began asking Isaac for specifics, wanting to know if such a project was feasible for their own locations. Isaac shared his knowledge freely. He explained the engineering principles, the drainage requirements, the importance of proper support framing, and the time investment necessary to build something that would actually function rather than collapse. Some trappers attempted their own tunnels over the following years. Most abandoned the projects as too labor-intensive for their circumstances, but several succeeded, creating their own hidden passages that provided security and options when situations demanded them. The tunnel itself remained functional for another 7 years. Isaac returned to his original camp the following spring after the wolves had moved on. His main cabin was undamaged, exactly as he'd left it, and the tunnel showed no structural deterioration. He continued trapping in the area until 1845, when declining beaver populations and changing markets made the mountain man life increasingly unprofitable. When Isaac finally left the mountains for good, he sealed both tunnel entrances carefully but didn't destroy them. Some part of him believed another person might eventually need what he'd built, and destroying functional infrastructure seemed wasteful. Historical records suggest the tunnel remained intact until at least 1853, when a surveying party exploring the area for potential railroad routes noted an unusual double cabin structure with what appeared to be connecting underground construction. The specific location of Isaac Drummond's camp was lost to history as the Montana Territory developed and old landmarks disappeared. But the principle behind his survival lived on in frontier construction practices. The idea that redundancy mattered, that having a second exit could mean the difference between life and death, that investing time in preparation was worth more than any amount of quick building. These concepts influenced how later settlers approached construction in dangerous territories. Isaac had proven that thinking beyond conventional wisdom could save your life when conventional wisdom failed.